guys, today I'm going to be showing you how I watercolored this floral piece that you see here, and I'm also going to be answering some questions along the way, so let's get started. I'm going to be using some Canson watercolor paper, and instead of watercolor, I actually am using this set of gouache paint. If you haven't heard of gouache before, it's sort of in between a watercolor and an acrylic, so it kind of has the watery consistency of watercolors, but it has a little bit more opacity so that you can get looks that are more similar to what you would get with acrylic paint. So I'm going to use this paint today and really water it down so that I can get it more translucent so that it looks a little bit more like watercolor. So I'm going to start just squeezing out small amounts of this into a mostly clean palette here. And while I do that, I'm going to start answering some questions. So I did a poll on Instagram and on YouTube asking you guys for some questions, and 2 of you were kind enough to answer me. To the rest of you, how dare you, but I'm not going to take it personally, and I hope you guys will enjoy these questions anyway. So since I'm doing this watercolor illustration, I thought I'd start with the first question, which is where to get affordable, good quality watercolors. And buying an affordable set of gouache like this is a really good option because I feel like one of the major pitfalls of more affordable sets of watercolors is that they don't have enough pigment, but since these are formulated to be a little bit more opaque, I feel like you can get a richer watercolor look by just watering these down a little bit. I got this set that I'm using at Michael's, and I think it was like 15 bucks, and of course I used a coupon so it was even cheaper, so this is definitely a very affordable option. And since a little bit goes a long way since you water it down, it will last you a long time as well. If you would prefer to get an actual watercolor set and not a gouache set, you can get a similar sort of deal with the watercolor in tubes like this, and I feel like those are a little bit easier to manipulate since you can just squeeze it out into a palette and control the water that you need to add. But if you prefer a palette, I would also recommend checking out this Inktense palette that I am showing you here. I've used this in a previous video and I've showed how I used it kind of like a watercolor, although technically it is an ink, and you can get some really cool layering effects with this since once the ink dries, it doesn't get reactivated by water, so you can get some really cool layering of colors there. So now that I have all my colors chosen in my palette, I'm going to take some clean water, and first things first, while my water is clean, I'm going to take my brush and just add a good amount of water to each of these little palette sections. Like I said, I'm going to be watering these pigments down so that they are a little more translucent, so I'm just making sure to add a good amount so that it's not too opaque to start with. Now that my colors are diluted and mixed up, I'm going to start painting. So I'm going for a monochromatic floral piece here, and I wanted to stick with this blue color scheme because I feel like it's very wintry, so it's appropriate for the season. And then I also just brought in white and black because I always like to have those to lighten or darken no matter what color palette I'm using. And I'm starting off by painting a rose here. And you can see here how the gouache is really just performing like watercolor since I've watered it down so much, and I can just play around with different levels of saturation within this one flower. I'm painting sort of like a rose type of flower with a lot of different layers. I feel like this is the kind of flower that always looks really complicated when you see it in a piece of art, but it's actually really simple because all you have to do is create these semicircle shapes and kind of just create that contrast in the different levels of opacity. And once I have that base laid down, I'm going in with a more concentrated, darker blue that I've mixed with some black as well. And I'm just holding my brush vertically and dabbing it in the center while the paper is still wet, because while it's still wet, that water will kind of move that pigment around just a little bit without using my brush to spread the color around so that it spreads more naturally. Then I'm gonna go a little bit below that and do another similar flower, but this time in a lighter and more translucent shade of blue. When you're doing a monochromatic piece like this, it's really nice to have differences in the saturation so that there's still contrast even though there's only one color. So you'll see that I am playing around with different opacity levels and saturation levels so that when the piece all comes together as a whole, there's a lot of differences in value. Now I'm gonna go ahead and draw a different type of flower. This is a very simple 5-petaled flower, and again just dabbing at the middle with that darker shade of blues, and you'll see how that pigment automatically just moves because the paper is wet, and I love seeing that effect. It's one of the best parts of watercolor for me. I just love seeing how the color can move all on its own without you doing pretty much anything, and of course the results are always going to be a little bit different because you're not really controlling anything and just letting the water do its thing. So while I continue this piece, I'm going to move on to my next question, which is where do you get affordable and good bullet journals? So I know this is probably pretty obvious, but I guess my number one recommendation would be Amazon, just because it's very easily accessible to most people and you can browse the selection very easily, and there's a lot of different types of journals. I've tried and recommended a few of those journal options already, so I'm not going to go too much into detail. But I guess another suggestion I would have is if you live near like a TJ Maxx or a Marshall's, I found some pretty cute journals in the stationery section, so I would check those kinds of stores as well. And then again, just going back to your typical big box craft stores like Michael's and AC Moore, I would check those. I know you can definitely get Moleskine notebooks there, and I think those are good starter bullet journals if you're just trying things out and you want something affordable. And I guess this definition would also depend on what you define as affordable, because the current one I'm using is the Scribbles That Matter journal, and that one's only about maybe $22, which I think is affordable, but somebody else told me that it wasn't. So I guess it's just up to what you're willing to spend. But for me, if I'm using a journal for 6 months to a year, getting a high quality journal that I'm going to enjoy using every day is worth the $20 or so. I've already done a few different types of flowers, not too many different types though. I just like to stick to a couple of different flowers and then just vary in the shape and the colors of them so that it looks more dynamic without going too crazy and having like a bouquet of 10 different flowers. I'm continuing my painting here by starting with some leaves, and I'm using the leaves now to fill in the edges and create a nice shape for my arrangement here. I'm going to be doing two basic types of leaves, a smaller one and a larger one. Again, creating size contrast so that the piece is more interesting to look at. The next question I want to discuss is how to be motivated to bullet journal every day. This is kind of a hard question to answer because it really depends on what your reasons for bullet journaling are, but I think one thing that you can incorporate is setting aside a specific time for you to bullet journal every day. So it can be 10 minutes in the morning, right after you wake up or before you go to work, just so that you can look at what's on your agenda. I think that's a great way to start the day so that you're more mentally prepared for what's going to happen and that you just start with the right mindset. And if you're not a morning person, then you can also do this the night before so that you can go to sleep with peace of mind and know that everything is all set for the next day. Another thing you might try if you don't already do this is to set up all of your weekly and monthly spreads all in one sitting. This could be helpful if you find it hard to get motivated to do like the more creative side of bullet journaling and you want it for the more productive side. I know that I personally like to have all of my layouts laid out for the entire month so that I never have to have anything at a pause or a standstill just because I don't have the spreads ready for it. And that way it'll be easier for you to open your journal and to know that everything's already all set up and ready for you. So the next question is not art or bullet journal related, but I thought it was a pretty good one anyway. And somebody asked me, what is my favorite part of my culture? So I guess I'll start off with what my culture actually is. I'm Chinese American. So I kind of had to think about this one a little bit because as anyone who's a first or second generation immigrant would know, it's kind of hard to identify your culture when it's such a blend of two different ones. But when I look back on my childhood and how I grew up, the one thing that stands out is the role that food has played in my life. Anybody that knows me knows that I am kind of obsessed with food. I mean, if you guys have been watching my Plan With Me videos, you know that in every weekly layout, I leave space for meal planning because that is just such a central part of my life and it's something that I think about all the time. And as ridiculous as it sounds, I think this is because I grew up in a culture where cooking food for others is an act of service, and it's something that brings joy to the person who's cooking and the person who's enjoying the food. And at many, many family celebrations, the central thing that we gather around is always food. And the wonderful thing about it is there's never any guilt associated with indulging either, at least in my family. And I think that's such a special thing to have grown up around because I feel like in American culture, or maybe just these days, sometimes there's this negativity or even shame about just enjoying food with your friends or family if you feel like it's too much or if you're just indulging yourself. And I don't know, that just kind of makes me sad because I feel like you should just be allowed to eat what you want and be happy about it. I mean, as long as it's okay for you, of course, and in moderation, but I just don't think that you should ever feel guilty about eating food that makes you happy. And then besides all of this about the attitude and celebration of food, there's also the actual food. I mean, who doesn't like Chinese food, right? And since I grew up with amazing homemade food, I learned how to make that all for myself, and that's something that I'm so grateful for. So that's it. I'm gonna stop talking about my love for food and just move on with the actual content that you came here for. So moving on with my floral watercolor, I'm filling in a couple more areas at the top because I feel like they needed a little something more. So I'm adding one other type of flower. I'm basically creating a stem and then turning my paintbrush vertically and just dabbing at it with a mostly dry brush so that I can get these little dots of color so that it looks more like a filler flower. I didn't want any more large focal flowers because I think the layout and volume of those is already enough, so I just wanted something to fill in the space a little bit more without adding too many leaves. Then I just started adding the final touches to this painting. So I added both white and darker dots to the center of the flowers just to create a little bit more texture. And then the last thing I did was to dilute some of my white paint with just a tiny touch of blue as well. And I'm watering it down so that it's a nice liquid consistency. And then I'm going to take my paintbrush and flick little splatters of paint onto my paper. I know this seems a little crazy when you just spent all this time painting this wonderful piece, and you can totally skip this if you like a more clean look, but I like the artsy, messy look of the paint splatters, so that's what I'm doing here. I just set that piece aside to dry while I talk about one last question, which is where to get affordable calligraphy pens. And I wasn't really sure what this person meant by calligraphy pens, because if you mean like actual calligraphy pens with the nibs, then I don't really know about that. But if you mean more like brush lettering pens, then I can show you a few options. The first one, which is my favorite option, is this Japanese pen. It's from Pentel and it's called the Sign Pen, and I think it has a longer name that I can't really remember, but I will link it down below. And I really like this pen because of the tip. It's both soft and firm. It's kind of hard to describe, but it has a really nice resistance to it. So you could get both thin and thick strokes. It's not too soft so that it's hard to get those really thin strokes, because I feel like some pens are like that and then it's hard to really get that sharp contrast, and I like that you can really do that with this pen. I think it's only a few bucks and you can buy it on Amazon, but I've also been able to find these at small local stationery stores, so if you have one of those more boutique-y stores, then I would definitely check those out. So yeah, I think that's my favorite one for practicing lettering. And then another option are the Tombow dual brush pens, which I'm sure you've seen me and like every other bullet journaler use. So it's really nice to practice with these if you already have them on hand so that you don't need to buy anything extra. I will say the one thing about these is that the brush is a lot larger than the Pentel pen, so it's harder to get more precise lettering, and I typically have to write a lot bigger with this pen to accommodate that larger tip. And the last option is to use Crayola's Super Tip markers. These actually aren't even a calligraphy or brush lettering pen at all. You can see the tip is just like a normal marker, but I find that I'm able to get a pretty nice variation in thick and thin strokes with this marker because it has a pretty soft tip. As long as you practice to control your pressure right, I think that you should get some pretty good looks with this as well. And it's nice that these are the most affordable of the three and come in a lot of different colors. And you can use them all throughout your bullet journal as well. So that wraps up this video with this watercolor piece with some questions along the way. And if you didn't get a chance to ask me any questions, make sure to leave one in the comments down below and then I can do it for a future video. Or you can follow me on Instagram so the next time I do a call, you'll be able to see that poll and then you can submit one there as well. I hope that this was helpful for you guys and that you enjoyed watching a little bit of painting. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you again next time. Bye!